the produce section is actually heading towards more complexity through more choice.
One, two, three.
Coming up, we're talking to Jack Richardson all about the produce section of the grocery store, nerding out around strategies with respect to categorization. The Modern Acre podcast explores the latest in business, investing, technology, and sustainability in agriculture, and we're your hosts, Tyler and Tim Nuss. If you'd like to dig deeper with The Modern Acre, check out our membership community, The Modern Acre Co-op. The Modern Acre podcast is presented by American Ag Credit. American Ag Credit is a proud member of the Farm Credit System, which was created more than 100 years ago with the sole purpose of serving the financial needs of farmers and ranchers. From small farms to the largest agribusiness enterprises, American Ag Credit understands agriculture and how to structure customized financial solutions. Just like many of the guests we have on the pod, American Ag Credit recognizes that the evolution of agriculture is inevitable and exciting. Their goal is to be at the forefront of this evolution, partnering with producers to grow their future in ways they haven't imagined yet. To learn more about American Ag Credit and to receive exclusive access to reports from Terrain, a research and insight service of American Ag Credit, visit agloan.com/terrain or check the link in our show notes.
Ty, this was a super fun edition of Jack's newsletter. Growing up as sons of farm kids, every time we went to the grocery store, our dad just V-lined it to the produce department, picking up every single piece of produce. What's the label on it? Where's it coming from? What's the price point? There was just so much variability in the produce section, and it was cool to kind of talk through how retailers look at like segmenting the produce section.
You're not a member of the Nuss household if you're not being observant in the produce section. Like I am always looking out for prices, where stuff is, any new produce that's out, like, oh, is it watermelon season yet? Like, if you're not observing what's going on, you might be excommunicated from the family.
Yeah, I think all summer long, every grocery store I go in, I always do a price check on watermelons. Like, what's the market doing? Are we at $5.50 a melon? Are we at $6? Are we at $7? How are things tracking right now?
I find like squash in the fall, and I'm like, oh, what's this variety? Is this something that we can grow? What's going on here? Like, you always got to be on your A game.
Totally.
Well, guys, we get into just all of the complexity related to the produce section, which is the crown jewel of the store. And Jack's newsletter hits in on all this stuff in detail. We kind of talk about a few different areas and ideas around how to segment the store. So hope you guys enjoy this conversation. Be sure to be subscribed to the newsletter, and you can check out that whole edition. We'll link in the show notes. All right, we have Jack back on the pod. This was maybe my favorite newsletter. They're all my favorite, but I think this one was particularly interesting, all about the produce section. And I think it's something that we haven't really like doubled down on and discussed a ton on the podcast. And so excited to jam on it with both of you guys. Let me tell you a little story here. So I get lists from my wife to go pick up stuff at the grocery store. Okay. And it is one of the hardest things to do. I feel like when I get a list from my wife and I go into the store, my mind just completely, I black out. I don't know where anything is. Like something about the list and the stress of it, I just can't figure it out. The produce section in particular is quite confusing, especially my local spot. One example of this is garlic. So we're a very regular user of garlic in the Nuss household, and we kind of go back and forth between getting, whole garlic cloves that you have to kind of peel yourself, which is quite annoying and tedious, but it's, much cheaper to buy like that. Or sometimes we'll buy the pre-peeled, right? They have it at Trader Joe's, they have it at other grocers. And in my local, it's a Vons, the peeled garlic is like tucked away in like a niche organic section, not next to any other kind of related produce. And I go back in there and I still have to hunt for this peeled garlic every time. And then I went in last night got to get garlic. We're cooking dinner that night. So I'm like, I'm going to get peeled because we're short on time. I'm not going to get the whole clove. I finally find where it's at, the bags of it. They're all expired. Every single one of the bags are expired. And I'm like, do you know why they're expired, guys? It's because no one can find them. Okay? No one can find the peeled garlic, and that's why they're all sitting there expired. Even the people who work there, the staff, they don't know where it is. They don't know how to replace it. So this is my rant that clearly we're in a good position to talk about this because the current setup is not working. So, Jack, when you were talking about how it's structured, I was like, there is a lot to improve upon here because I can't find my peeled garlic. So with that, we're going to start. Jack, tell us a little bit more about this whole produce section and the strategy behind it, because I find this fascinating.
Well, Todd, I think that's a great launch pad to better understand the produce section over the last couple of decades. And so a retailer will generally have one of two formats for grouping their produce. And that is grouping by growing type. So organic on one side, conventional on the other. And conventional is often not called conventional, it's just not called organic. And that can be referred to as segregation. And then on the other side, you have growing by produce type, and that is integration. And in that latter bucket, if you're looking at avocados or bananas, you walk up to the avocado section on your left, organic on the right, conventional or regular. You move to oranges, same deal. Organic on the left, conventional on the right. And I think an interesting point that you're alluding to, Ty, is the footprint of customers. And so if we were at a high level to look at the integration versus the segregation formats, and this is oversimplification, but let's consider three types of customer personas: the always organic, the sometimes organic, and the never organic. So if you're looking at the always organic persona, it doesn't matter what the produce format is. That person is going to seek out their organic produce, even if it's extra steps, even if it's inconvenient. And of course, if it's integrated or organic avocados on the left, conventional avocados on the right, they'll also seek that out. And then let's actually jump to the third persona, never organic. Again, the store format doesn't really matter for that persona. They're going to walk to their types of produce they're going to pick up, and they're always going to look on the right for the conventional produce. But the middle persona, the sometimes organic, that is where the store format really comes into play. And so for a myriad of reasons, this person might buy some organic produce and then some conventional produce. I would generally say I fall into that bucket. And so if you have the integrated format where, okay, I see avocados, going to walk over there. Okay, I'm interacting with organic. That means that there's a slightly increased chance that I'm going to buy that organic avocado versus having to walk all the way to a different side of the produce section where the organic only section is. That's an additional burden for me. So that's one way that retailers think about the store formats within their produce section.
Yeah, it just seems like in the past couple of years, the space has gotten more and more competitive and confusing, where there's a lot of companies that are wanting to differentiate in the produce department, and sometimes retailers are hesitant to do that. Like that's where there's been the huge push to private label to kind of make things more simplified. When you have multiple countries of origin, multiple brands, different growing styles, it's becoming a little hectic in there. So excited to kind of dig into it. Jack, you and I spent time together at Appeal. Like Appeal was looking to differentiate in the produce category. Maybe talk to us about some of the kind of insights there of how you were thinking about the produce department during your time at Appeal.
Appeal, very much B2B model. We were coupling that with a consumer-facing brand, with the thinking that a story of transparency and sustainability would drive further demand. And the future that we painted for our investors was an Appeal-only section, similar to how some retailers have an organic-only section. And it wasn't until more recently, if you were to zoom out and realize, okay, what has occurred in the produce space over the last decade? Well, you have an ag tech company like Appeal that has raised hundreds of millions. But Appeal is not alone. There are a handful of other companies, technology companies operating in produce. Of course, vertical farms come to mind, that have raised tens of millions to hundreds of millions of dollars. And yes, they might have a B2B model, but they need to couple that with a consumer-facing brand, in part to justify that price premium. And I would not be surprised if essentially all of these companies have painted a future for their investors of a plenty only section or a Gotham Greens only section. And if you were to extrapolate that in let's say all of these players that have raised a bunch of money win, establish an enduring product placement and a price premium, then what does that produce section look like in the next 5 to 10 years? It actually looks like a very crowded produce section. Instead of 2 types for each category, let's say strawberries, organic and conventional, you might have upwards of 6 types. And I'll pause in a moment, but you could consider another category like the drink aisle in the grocery store. What is the history of the drink aisle? An explosion of choice over the last decade. You have kombucha. You have half a dozen kombucha brands. You have half a dozen coconut water brands. You have a dozen protein drink, ready-to-drink brands. And so maybe that's the way the produce section falls. But Tim, you in particular, having worked in produce, I doubt that will be the case considering a retailer considers their produce section to be the crown jewel of the store. It needs to exude quality. It needs to exude cleanliness and an ease to navigate. So ultimately, I do think there is a bit of a zero-sum game going on for these venture-backed technology companies that are operating in the produce sector.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with that, where there's very limited shelf space, and I think retailers are hesitant to add in new SKUs, like just look at a category like grapes, where you have a green, a red, and a black, and there's all these different varieties. I think there's over 100 varieties of table grapes grown in California, but retailers really just want to market, these 3 options to consumers. It's a little bit overwhelming, like when you're talking about 6 different SKUs of strawberries, like when majority of consumers are going in and they want strawberries, like they don't want to be making 6 decisions, like, yes, maybe organic versus conventional. They make that trade-off decision in their head on what they want to go with. But having to decide between 6 different options, I think, is just overwhelming for consumers. I think retailers are going to be resistant to give consumers that many options.
It's really interesting, right? Because it's like the drink aisle, there's copious decisions, right, and options. And I'm like, is there a future world where the produce section is like commodity versus not commodity, right? Where it's like you have the fresh commodity produce that customers are looking for the lowest price option, but then there's all these other non-commodity, which is kind of similar to the drink section, where it's like a value-added product, energy drink, kombucha, etc. Is there a section of produce that's like that? And it's a separate section where it's CEA, indoor agriculture, it's regenerative ag, it's some of these other groups that you brought up, special traits, Jack, that you brought up in the newsletter. I'm wondering if that's a future distinction, is just commodity versus non-commodity, obviously marketed in a better way.
Yeah, another way you can look at it is kind of imported versus local, where I think domestic retailers have a preference to stock local produce and kind of push that to the consumers. There's a big benefit there sourcing locally, but there is kind of this counter seasonality where they need to have apples on the shelf year round, grapes on the shelf year round, and they can't achieve that just from one growing season. So there's imported produce playing a role. And like when I think about myself as a shopper, like that's one kind of like caveat that I have when my wife and I are shopping of like, oh, she wants grapes, and be like, oh, are they from Mexico or from California? And like I'm kind of picky on country of origin that I'm sourcing from. But when you look at like a global perspective, having worked in produce export, like in certain countries, like product to the US or product to Canada is a luxury premium good. Like if you go to a grocery store in Canada, like they're not really concerned with buying local because the local population doesn't trust their food supply. And so like they really pay a premium and prioritize imported fruit, especially coming from North America. So that was like interesting depending on where you're at, how that shapes the produce department.
It's a good point, Tim. The argument or the foundation I've laid out so far is organic and conventional, but in reality, you really could add another layer, and that is the source of origin, local on one end of the spectrum, imported on the other end. And from a price premium perspective, there is a significant, just go to your local farmer's market, and people are willing to pay upwards of 2x the price for a pint of blueberries than they are at a grocery store. Even if those blueberries are grown in the United States at the grocery store, people really have a strong preference and with that willingness to pay for local. And then on the other end of the spectrum, it's interesting, Tim, you were mentioning that in some foreign markets, they actually view it differently. They will pay the premium if it's grown in the US or grown in South America, because based on their growing region, their climate, they cannot grow that specialty crop. And so they really do value the imported produce.
I'll give you one more layer here to think about. I'm thinking about varieties where, like, we've seen huge proliferation of proprietary genetics and varieties in the produce category. I feel like every vertically integrated apple shipper in the Northwest has their own kind of proprietary club apple that they're uniquely positioning. In grapes, you have like the cotton candy grapes, the witch's fingers, all these kind of unique varieties. Like, some are open where any grower could grow these. Some of them are more controlled where one or two has the license for these varieties. And you see this popping up in the produce department. I think Driscoll's has their sweetest batch where it's like 10% of their crop that's hyper sweet. They can market it and differentiate it that way. So I think that's another area that I think companies will succeed in the produce department, is having varieties that no one else can have. And when consumers want these varieties, retailers aren't going to have a choice but to feature those products that consumers want to get their hands on.
I think there's a business opportunity here. I think that this complexity, we're like adding produce layers by the second here on this podcast of how we can distinguish and how you can have a framework for the produce section. There's got to be a company that focuses on, providing a solution to retailers of, hey, we're going to take all of the data at our disposal, all the supply data, all of the segment data, all of the freshness, data to optimize a produce section for you. Because it's like there is this balance, Tim, of like, at the end of the day, we can only have two types of broccoli, right? Like, for as an example, right? Like, is it conventional organic? Is it a special trait? Is it indoor grown? Whatever. And so there's got to be this sweet spot of trying to, maximize revenue in the produce section, and then obviously you need unique price points to drive that revenue. But there's got to be a world in which someone creates like a platform that ingests all this data and can output a suggestion of, hey, you should have the organic grapes and the cotton candy grapes, and you should have the regeneratively grown apples and the commodity apples, right? Like, there's got to be some way to ingest all this information, and it's a lot of information, and maybe it's the perfect time with AI. But I feel like my guess, Jack, is that retailers are just like, they're slowly iterating it. They're like doing little test cases, right? They're putting the CEA just right along this in the leafy green section, right? They're just kind of like tinkering. But if there's a company that can come to them and say, hey, we're going to actually like grow your revenue by 50% in produce by optimizing all of these inputs, I feel like that's a really interesting business model.
Ty, I like that idea. I kind of think it along the lines of, you're feeding this model all these disparate data sources and all these variables, but the output is actually simplicity. It's streamlined, and it's kind of a nice juxtaposition of the thesis that I've put forth in this newsletter, that of the produce section is actually heading towards more complexity through more choice. And so maybe we transition into the segmentation I've made of these new venture-backed players within produce. And with that, with the understanding there may be a bit of a zero-sum game, the tactics or the levers that I've identified to allow each of these players to increase their chance of establishing a strong foothold. So with that, again, we've spoken about organic and conventional being the reality of today. I've segmented the new players into 4 groups. Those 4 groups, and we've alluded to a number of them here. First up, CEA, controlled environment agriculture. This encompasses greenhouse grown, vertical farms. Second up, regenerative. This is a little unique. This is less venture backed, if you will, and more so a result of many farmers. Number 3, food waste fighter. So of course this would capture a company like Appeal. And 4, and I believe this is the newest of the segments, a trait optimizer. So this could be hologenetics or a row 7 seeds. And the argument that I've made in this newsletter is that with this zero-sum game going on, the 4 levers that one of these individual companies or a segment as a whole can establish both enduring product placement as well as an enduring price premium as across the 4 dimensions: branding, product expansion, geography expansion, and lower cost.
No, I love how you've broken this down, Jack. It's a great addition. So I encourage folks that are listening to this that haven't read the newsletter, go check it out. The Modern Acre newsletter on Substack. It's a great addition. Jack, it's been a pleasure as always. Excited to see what you dive into next.
Thanks, guys. Talk soon.
Love having Jack on the podcast. Be sure to subscribe to the newsletter so you get the next edition in your inbox, and we'll have Jack back on the podcast to discuss it, jam on it in the podcast forum. Nothing like it. So hope you guys enjoyed it. We'll talk to you next week.